Okay, so I think I'm going to get us started. So we're here today to talk much ado about memories. This is I think a really impactful conversation to start. I think we can start by introducing ourselves here at the kitchen table. So if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, I am Missy Harden, and I have the privilege of doing care consultation with families on the dementia care journey.
And I'm Justin Mutter. I am a geriatrician, and I'm also the Chief Health Officer of Alula. I'm excited to be here having this conversation with these great people.
And I'm Bridgid Eversole. I am one of the co-founders of Alula and the Chief Community Officer, and I am a caregiver to my parents.
And I'm Elaina. I work for Dowda Senior Consultants, and it is such an honor to sit with the three of you and to walk through this conversation together. And I hope that it'll be super impactful for the families and the caregivers that hear the wisdom and guidance that's shared today, and hopefully it'll be something that can be shared. So we're just really grateful for us all to be able to get together and spend this time together. And I think, you know, families, when you get that dementia diagnosis or you're worried that that may be something that's coming in the future, there's a lot of fear and shame and forgetting that there are other people on this journey, and it can feel very isolating. We want to talk today, start off about what are some early signs and changes that you may be worried about, or maybe sending up some signals in the back of the head, and what do they mean?
It's one of the hardest things about this is that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and then there's also a lot of, as you were saying, fear and concern and challenges in interpreting what one may be saying about their family member or their loved one. And so really one of the first important steps is when we're seeing signs that could be consistent with cognitive impairment of any sort, then we really need to dive in and try to figure out together as a family what this might be, and because it might just be normal aging. As we all get older, we all have difficulty with a variety of cognitive tasks that came easier to us when we were younger, and you know, things that may have been much easier for me when I was in my 20s are maybe not so easy, and so we need to be able to differentiate. Is this normal aging, or is this something that we need to be concerned about? The three main categories that we think about when it comes to cognitive impairment are normal cognitive changes on the one hand, and then something called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI for short. And that means basically that someone has memory or cognitive issues that are now affecting their daily function in certain ways, but not in ways that are major or dramatic. So, for example,
what would major or dramatic be? Because I think often any change feels major or dramatic when you're. So what would clinically, what would that look like to you?
And it's one of the examples I often give is someone doing their tax returns. So if I now have difficulty with managing my finances all by myself, but I can still get through my tax returns, and I may have to check myself 4 times and make sure it's right, but I'm independently able to do that. It's just much harder than it used to be for me to do that. That's mild cognitive impairment. A dementia diagnosis, on the other hand, is where we have lost our ability to be fully independent with whatever that task might be. So in the context of tax returns, I tried to do it, but I just couldn't do it independently. I had to turn it over to my loved one, and I just can't do it anymore. So those are sort of the three main categories to think about.
That's helpful to put it in that context of that thing that we all have to do every year. Yeah. What would that look like with normal aging? So you have a place where you can still get through it, but it's a little bit harder. You have to hand it off to someone else. What does that normal aging look like in that context?
It can be challenging to differentiate. Tax returns are hard, right? I wish it was easier. I wish it was easier for all of us, but right, we can have difficulties cognitively that aren't affecting our function on a daily basis. Maybe, for example, it's very normal for us as we get older to have much more difficulty with multitasking. Multitasking is something that we're good at when we're younger, and oftentimes as we get older, that becomes something that's difficult. So generally speaking, normal cognitive aging, we're able to continue to go about our daily life doing the things that we normally do in ways that are not impacted by those memory or cognitive changes that we notice in ourselves.
Are there things that you see as a physician that often like send up those red flags for family, but do sometimes wind up being normal aging?
Yeah, so one of the things that can be really challenging is the intersection between our mood and our mental health and cognitive changes. Sometimes mental health concerns look very much like memory and cognitive changes, and I'm sure, Missy, you've seen this, but it can be very hard to tease that out, and that's where it's really important to go to your primary clinician or go to a memory specialist, whether that's a geriatrician or a neurologist, to try to tease out that possibility, because sometimes when we get older, depression looks very much like I'm having trouble remembering things. It doesn't always look like depression may look when someone is younger. And so really being able to go see a provider who can try to make sure we're looking at that is really important.
Yeah. So you have a loved one that has memory impairment diagnosis. Yes. What did those early signs look like for your family?
Well, it was interesting because the first thing was I got 2 birthday cards out of the blue, and this, she was always exact on birthdays, anniversaries, everything. And I thought, well, that's really weird. She must be stressed out or something that I've got 2 birthday cards. And it wasn't a big deal, but I just noticed it. And then that was in the spring, and in that fall, we were having a conversation of something that was happening in the news, and she asked my sister-in-law what her brother thought about this particular thing. And her brother had died very tragically a few years before, but he was also my brother's best friend. So he was somebody who was a major person in our family. Yeah. And, my sister-in-law said, well, if he were alive, I think, and so that we all stopped dead in our tracks on that one and said, this is not like a normal thing. And so then my parents were getting ready so this is my mother, I didn't say that. It still feels like I'm just not, it's hard to say my mother has it because that was always her biggest fear. And I feel like I'm betraying her some way when I say my mother has dementia. So it's hard for me to say that, but
because of her feelings or because of yours?
Because of her feelings. I never want to, I got the golden ticket with my parents, and I'm so grateful for that. But so I feel this betrayal because she never wanted to have it. She still thinks she's fine, and she is fine. She just has, cognitive impairment. But so they were getting ready to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, and we were having a big party, and I'm a musician and was in charge of the music, and there was going to be a church service as well as the reception, and she was just calling people at random times, like 10:30 at night, which was never something she did, and just, checking up and triple checking and everything. So I talked to my dad about it, and he said, oh, I think she's just, stressed out about the party. And then after that it was, they decided to move closer to us. I think she's stressed out about the move. And even one of my sisters said, my daughter's getting a little upset because it doesn't seem like grandma's listening to her anymore and hearing what she's saying. And we said, maybe it's something else. And so it was really hard for people in my family to come to this conclusion. But then we got to the point where there was no question, this is what it is. And, it just kept progressing, and she had a really great cognitive reserve. She was a brilliant woman, and she, you know, when we go to the doctors, they see a snapshot in time, and so she could hold it together. She might crumble as soon as we left, but it was really hard to get the diagnosis. It was really hard to just go through all of the early stages with that. And many times I thought, am I crazy? Like, am I just seeing things that aren't there?
Right.
And so here we are, and it's, you know, she does have it, but it's definitely been a journey.
Do you mind sharing, if you could go back in time and talk to those clinicians, what was being missed in your view? Like what were you needing from a clinical team that, in terms of getting answers and clarity, that you weren't able to get?
Well, I think the biggest thing, again, I didn't want to betray my mother, and of all the things that she forgets, the one thing she would remember is if I said something against her beliefs in a doctor's appointment. And my dad and I go to every single appointment, we still do, but if I said very gently, well, you know, maybe your memory, maybe we should do this screening test, maybe we should do this, and she would just be furious with me. And so I think the PCP was doing, she's wonderful. I cannot say enough wonderful things about, and I'm very lucky that we have the PCP we have. She knew something was going on, but she couldn't tell exactly what, and you know, there's only so many hours in a day. So she referred us to the geriatrician, who, again, they knew something was going on, but it's hard to pinpoint what is it that's going on. And because, again, in that snapshot, they don't know me, and they don't know my mother on a daily basis. And even though I'm advocating for her, and my father is, it's still, I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. It's hard because, I mean, I would say as much as I could. And then even when the neurologist said, would you be more comfortable if you and your father stepped out of the room with me? I can't say yes because
Yeah, and
again,
that's where
like,
I think it's so helpful, because you don't want to betray your mom. You don't want to make the person who's living with brain change, whether they're aware or not, feel less.
right.
So instead, what if you had been able to get some observations to your clinician before the visit so that she could have made a more informed assessment?
Right, and that's what
With
we ended up
sensitivity.
doing, was we sent messages through my chart and said, this is what's happening. And if every time we go to the appointment, if my husband has to take them, I'm usually the point person, but if he takes them, he gets a physical letter to the doctor before we go in, and we'll say, this is what's going on. And I think I wish I would have thought to do that 6 years ago. And instead it might have been 3 years ago where I started doing that. So,
But you are doing that, right?
We
So
are
you
doing
can't
it
go
now.
back, but her care is, and her relationship with her provider is more informed,
correct.
without making her have to recount something that she's not aware of, right? That, or she doesn't remember,
Right.
or you're ganging up on me,
Yeah.
which is not obviously your intent.
Right.
I'm curious, when you go to the doctor's appointments, where do you sit in that exam room?
You know, it's been funny. So my parents now have been married 58 years, and they're right next to each other. And if there's another chair, I will sit next to my mother, and I will say, I learned this from the geriatrician. When she comes in, my mom's a very huggy, touchy, loving human, and I observed the geriatrician with her. When my mom would get upset, she would just hold her hand or get very close to her. I'm sorry, I hope that's okay. So now, before they come in, I actually sit in the patient's chair, and my mom and dad sit next to each other, and then when they come in, I will go over and just put my hand on my mom's shoulder, or, you know, be somewhere. I never stand above her, just always
So in a
on her
really
level.
supportive position,
Right.
where the doctor can spend all his direction or her direction towards the patient.
Yes.
Have you been in that position where you have to ping pong?
Yeah, and it's actually one of the things that I talk about when I'm teaching students and residents and fellows about how to engage someone who may have difficulty engaging due to cognitive issues in a visit, because sometimes the tendency is someone reads a diagnosis on the list and then they walk in the room and they immediately turn to the loved one or turn to whoever else is in the room, and of course that immediately is a barrier for building rapport with the person living with dementia, and so it's really critical from the clinician side to have that engagement, that body language, that where we're engaging with everybody in the room constantly.
Yeah, plus you can do an assessment of your person. How long does it take her to respond to my questions? Can she answer questions? Does she defer to her care partner for answers? What's the pace? What's the reflection?
If you were that loved one sitting in the room with your person and the doctor's speaking to you instead, how do you kindly help guide that so that the physician's speaking instead to your loved one?
So when I coach folks, I say, oh, hey, mom, or hey, person, I'm here if you need me to help, but I would love to have you answer the doctor's questions.
That happens to me a lot.
And so coaching the provider is often something that family members can be empowered to do.
My father has Parkinson's, and so people assume with Parkinson's that he's cognitively impaired, which he's not. He's sharp, he's sharp. It just sometimes takes a moment for the words to get there. And so they'll look to me and I'll just say, Dad, what do you think? And usually I think like 99% of the time the provider picks it up and will go immediately to my dad and have the conversation.
On the flip side, as a provider, if you have a loved one with the best of intentions who wants to hop in there and provide the correct what they feel is the correct and accurate information, how do you coach from that other side too of how of getting the information from that person this is their lived experience?
I mean, anytime I walk into a room and one of the concerns is their memory or cognitive changes, the most important thing is to get to know the person. Because, and I often will start with 15 to 20 minutes of just conversation, right? Because you learn so much about someone just starting to talk. And then you learn how they like to communicate and what makes them tick. And so you can engage in those very person-centered ways with the patient, with the family. And that's something that I think families can feel empowered to encourage when they go into a visit, that, right, having that engagement about what this individual loves. Are they an antique collector who just absolutely loves anything having to do with antiques or antique furniture? Because then you can ask the question as a provider, as you've gotten to know them, say something like, what's your favorite antique piece in your house? Right? And if they have difficulty answering that question, that tells you a lot about where we are in this journey. And it tells you a lot about that in a person-centered way. So I think that's something that I think we can all focus on in the conversations. We're trying to understand what's happening. What is happening with the individual, unique person in front of us.
I think that's good to know too. Because I can imagine being in the doctor office with my mom and being like, let's get to business, right? Like, why are we talking about your antiques? Or like, no, here's the answer. But also knowing that is part of your process as a clinician, like that is with purpose. You're building rapport, and then it's also, there is some assessment that's happening along with those conversations.
It's a really dynamic assessment that allows you to get to see that person as a human being, right? So connect, not correct. And for the daughter that has the list of things that she wants to talk about her person, if she can do that in advance and hand it over, then she's still getting her needs met, answers to her questions, maybe not in that moment, but it's super important to see the person who's living with something they didn't ask for, or maybe doesn't have awareness of. I still am here, I still have abilities. They're changing. And that's what the provider can help notice.
Absolutely. When we bring up the word provider, I think we talk a lot about the neurologist. I think everyone knows a neurologist is part of this journey, but that is not the only stop on the provider journey. Can you talk us through what some of those other roles and...
Yeah, I mean, there are many primary care providers out there who are amazing at their work and passionate about caring for people who are struggling with this journey. And sometimes one doesn't need a neurologist or a geriatrician to help either with the diagnosis or with an overall care plan. And so I always recommend the first stop should be someone with whom you have that longitudinal relationship, and that's what primary care is for. Sometimes because they have that 10-year history of caring for somebody, and now someone is starting to experience brain changes, then that individual is going to be much more clued in, that provider is going to be much more clued in than some other person who hasn't met them yet, right? So that's always a great place to start. But things are challenging in the world of medicine, and many families feel like they need more clarity. And when that happens, then trying to get to a geriatrician or a neurologist can be really helpful. The other group to think about in terms of a specialty is neuropsychology, and sometimes people come around to neuropsychology sort of after having visited a neurologist or a geriatrician, but you can try to get in touch with a neuropsychologist well before seeing one of those specialists, and those individuals can do some testing and some assessment. They're often very good. They are neuropsychologists, right? So they are often very good at teasing out some of the things that we were talking about. What if someone's having mood changes in addition to memory changes, and it's hard to figure out what exactly is happening? They're often quite good at that. So they're another specialty to think about.
What is the difference between a PCP, your primary care, and a geriatrician? Like what?
Yeah,
what is the
that's
difference?
a great question. Geriatricians there are only about 7,000 practicing in the entire country, and so sometimes very hard to access geriatricians because there just aren't that many of them. But a geriatrician has extra training in the world of aging, broadly speaking. And so sometimes that's 1 year training, sometimes that's more. Typically, these are individuals who have trained in primary care, but then want to really focus on caring for aging populations. And so they have extra expertise in things like memory concerns or mood concerns in older adults. They often practice like primary care doctors, but they often also can practice like specialists. And so it's kind of a rare phenomenon. And so, but that's another group to think about along with neurology.
For your clinical team, for your parents, what have you built out in kind of your tool belt of clinicians?
Well, it's funny because we were just talking about this. My mom does have the PCP. She has the geriatrician as well. She has the neurologist, and then she has the neuropsych. So she's got the full deck. So, but at some point we've had this conversation. She gets herself in such a tizzy going to some of these specialists. So when do we say, and she also has other things going on. We have to see a pulmonologist. We have to see this. We have to see that. So when do we just streamline? And for example, her PCP is supposed to be retiring this summer, which I'm very sad about, but her geriatrician is wonderful. And so we'll be able to step in and have the geriatrician act as her PCP. But even with the other things, I mean, we know what's going on now. There's not, to me, is it worth it getting her into this state every time we have to go to the doctor? Or do we just live and, do fun stuff instead of doctor stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's what
quality of life,
the quality
right?
and just doing that. So that's where we are with it. So
I think sometimes too, there's this expectation the neurologist is going to fix this. They're a doctor, they're going to make this better. Neurologists are super smart and capable of diagnosing, but the day-to-day life is not their job. And so to be disappointed because the neurologist gave you a diagnosis but nothing else, well, yeah, that's that's where the continuum of care and the other providers can be so helpful. And I keep using the word provider. People who come alongside those living with brain change can look different, like me, right?
I was going to say, who are those other providers that you may not realize is your...
So just other resources, like maybe we need to start building our team. So someone that's going to help with care navigation, care management, social work, geriatric care managers, care consultants, even just someone in your community circle of friends that can help you build companion care so that the caregiver doesn't get so spent. Because if there's one person living with dementia, as the disease progresses, you're going to need 5 people to take care of that one person. Not all at once, that would be ganging up and that would be very kind. But the 24/7 reality, and for that person to speak into their care plan when they first get diagnosed. What do you want life to look like? If they can articulate it, great, let them hold the reins. If they can't, know your person and start building in those supports, because you can't just care for the person living with the disease. You also have to support their primary care partner. So I think there are some good resources out there to help with beyond diagnosis, which are super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
The actual living of it.
The actual living of it, yeah.
And Justin and I were talking the other day that the family nucleus isn't what it used to be. So we used to have all the family members around and you could take turns, but I mean, what is it, 11% of primary caregivers live an hour away from their person they're caring for. So I think it's really important to be able to find that community around you and build that community, because it gets lonely, it gets scary, it gets overwhelming, but it's also the biggest blessing I've ever had to be a caregiver and to be able to help my mother and my father during this stage of life. And that community aspect is so important, especially as families are spreading out more and more.
Yeah, and I think too, there is a growing movement in many communities, many cities, to focus care into the home, not just on the care management side, but also on the medical side even. So looking for providers who do house calls, because way more relaxing to have these conversations with one another and when you're around the kitchen table versus having to go in and find parking and get to the clinic and all
in
those,
a familiar environment where the person lives. Right?
Yeah, and then it's amazing. I mean, I have the privilege of getting to do house calls, and there's just something incredibly beautiful about walking over someone else's threshold and being in their space, and you get to learn so much more about them as a provider and really get a sense of what makes them tick and what they really care about and what their family cares about. And so looking for those resources can also be helpful.
So a little bit going back to getting that diagnosis as well, there are quite a few different screening tests that come up. Walk us through what those are and what they mean and what the differences are and why one over another.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to say is that getting some kind of screening test done is very helpful in understanding what's happening. However, in many cases that can be challenging. Sometimes the individual who's struggling with cognitive changes doesn't want to do it. And so that's why building that rapport is so important, so that hopefully everybody can engage in that screening test at some point. Sometimes the screening tests that people will get when they go to any provider tend to be very short and don't actually tell us a lot. So people may have heard of something called a mini cog. That's the fastest thing to do, and it can give you a snapshot for sure. but it's so brief and that it really sometimes can't help us with the diagnostic process and understanding what's happening. And so the others to think about that are pretty commonly used in many clinical settings are the mini mental status exam, or MMSE for short, and the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or the MoCA for short. And those are probably, there are some others out there, but those are probably the most commonly used ones. And so in terms of advocating for your loved one, when you're going to see the provider and really trying to answer that question of what's happening, advocating for one of those tests being done, I think, is a good thing.
For one of the 2 longer ones. Okay. And if your loved one is saying, I'm not doing this, is it necessary?
So sometimes it's not, for sure, because sometimes it just becomes, as one gets to know the patient, sometimes it's just very clear what's happening. And so, but then sometimes, as we were talking about, there are many things that can look like dementia or look like cognitive changes that are not in fact dementia or cognitive changes. And so being able to make sure we answer those questions, I think, can be really important. And you know, this is about rapport, this is about building a community of care around a person. And if you don't get to that screening test the first visit, maybe we can come back in 2 weeks and see what happens then, right? Again, that's the importance, as you were talking about that longitudinal relationship with a care team, because you may not be able to answer those questions on that visit, but you can set things up so that hopefully those questions get answered sooner rather than later.
And I think it's important too, oftentimes those tests you get a score. Well, the score doesn't tell you really a person's functional abilities, and the test, the MoCA or the MMSE, they're screenings. They're just sort of a baseline. This is where you are at this moment in time. I had a client who did the MoCA, bombed drawing a cube. Her son sent me a picture the next day on a cocktail napkin. She had drawn the thing and said, send this to Missy, let her know I was having a hard time in that moment. I got so much, I'm like, that was the best assessment I've ever done, because she remembered my name. It was the next day. She remembered that part of the test. And yes, she was living with dementia, but boy, did she have some good strength and personhood of like, hey, don't put me in this less category, see my abilities. So that was probably one of the best lessons I've ever learned, to say, don't go with the score. Go with the areas of cognition, the domains of cognition that this test is kind of showing that there's some challenges here. It doesn't mean that it's lost. It just means in that moment in time when you took this 30-item test, you didn't do so well in certain areas. So we're going to pay attention to that.
When my mom took the test for the first time, she was very furious about it, but she trusts the geriatrician, and she just made it a very casual, let's just do it. Let's just see what's going on. So she did it. And it was the part about drawing the clock. And she just said, why would I need to draw a clock? Nobody looks at clocks anymore. There's no second hands and hands. Why are we doing it? And so just, okay, you don't have to draw the clock. Well, no, of course I'm going to draw the clock. You know, and it was this, and she was not able to draw the clock, but she was feisty.
And she had great language, so she's got some visual motor changes happening, but nothing wrong with her communication in this moment, or her
could communicate for sure.
So there's so much more that you can get than a score.
Right.
Yeah.
But the score sometimes is the, okay, we need to consider further testing. And it's a baseline, so everyone 65 or older should get a screening done. So you have something to compare it to.
How do you make that happen at the doctor's office for everyone 65 or older? Is that just something they're going to offer you when you walk in, or?
Sometimes. It depends on what's going on in the primary care practice and what their particular approach is. I think many older adults will get something like a mini-cog, very, very brief engagement, but they may not get a more robust screening assessment. And so certainly if you have concerns, that's something I think to advocate for.
If your physician does not do that as part of your physical, what do you do?
Ask for it.
Yes, ask for it. And
yeah.
when you make your appointment, schedule time. Say, I would like the full cognitive assessment that's offered to me through my Medicare wellness exam.
Yeah.
Say those words one more time.
Okay. When you call to schedule your appointment,
Yeah.
ask for the full cognitive assessment that comes with your Medicare wellness exam. So it takes about 45 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Just for that testing
And
portion?
it's covered
Okay.
by Medicare, but you need to schedule enough time for your appointment. You can't just go in there and say, oh, could you, by the way, give me this?
Mm-hmm.
The doctor, it needs to be scheduled.
Mm-hmm.
So that,
Yeah, and that's something that, as you're saying, you can ask for very explicitly, because unfortunately the way of modern medicine, oftentimes you've got 15, 20 minutes. And so ahead of time being able to say, can we make this my Medicare annual wellness visit so that we can do all these things that are really important to me? Or say something like, can we have an extended visit? I just know that this is going to be something that we need to talk about for quite some time. Can we please book an extended visit? And most primary care clinics are going to say, yeah, sure, we'll figure that out and make sure that they get that scheduled so you don't feel rushed.
How often can you ask for an extended visit?
As long as you want, as many times as you want. I mean, part of this journey, of course, is advocacy, because the system, sadly, is not always set up to be person-centered. Mm-hmm. And sometimes my patients and families will say, "I'm so sorry, I'm pushing this on you." I'm like, no, advocate, like keep me honest, right? Keep us honest, because that advocacy is a absolutely critical part of building a care plan for your loved one.
Are there other things besides that you should be asking for? Other testing besides the cognitive screening that they can have access to?
Well, I think, and one of the things that Missy was talking about, in the medical speak world, sometimes we call this cognitive reserve. And so it's not just the test itself, it's being able to interpret the test through the person who's experiencing these challenges. And many people, when they start struggling with a memory or cognitive change, they have a lot of cognitive reserve. They're actually doing really well in so many ways, and continuing to be the wonderful person they are. And so making sure that the visit's also about that in positive ways, right? How are things going? We often focus very much in the medical world on what's not going well. And so being able to advocate and for a conversation about what are the things that are going well, what are the things you're still very, very passionate about. Some of my patients are incredible artists. And so we spend a lot of time saying, how's the painting going, right? What is going on in the space that you really care about? Because that is super important to continue to support across time and space. There's also always going to be a question about, do I need an MRI? Do I need a CT scan of my head? These kinds of things. That's something that you can work on with your provider. Sometimes it is necessary, sometimes it's not.
I've got two questions. And the first one you may not know the answer to, but when a family does ask for that extended visit, is that typically going to cost them more?
It should. That's a great question. It shouldn't. In the context of the Medicare annual wellness visit, oftentimes what providers do, this is in the primary care world, is they will schedule the Medicare annual wellness visit and tack on a regular follow-up visit to it. And that gives you the 45 minutes, sometimes an hour where you can go over all these things together. Medicare annual wellness visits don't cost any copays at all. So they're totally free. Now, if the provider then tacks on a regular follow-up visit to that, then there might be a copay. But generally speaking, we're not talking about significant increased costs to get an extended visit like that because of the ways that copays typically work.
And then my other question, as we've been talking this through, say you're on the other side of it where you personally are worried that there is something going on and your doctor's saying, no, you're fine, it's normal aging. Now what do we do? If I'm legitimately concerned that it's not normal aging.
Yeah, I think always feel free to get second and third opinions, right? And engage the community of care management and consultants, that Missy was talking about as well, not just in, the immediate clinic or hospital world. Because, right, sometimes we're not right? We're not omniscient about what might be happening. And so being able to reach out to other resources, get second opinions, third opinions, always an important way to try to work through that challenge.
What does it look like for you, Missy, when you're talking with a family, and I almost feel like there's a line of making sure that mom presents well at the doctor, but also making sure there's a realistic idea of what's going on?
So we all present well at the doctor. They say, how are you? We say, fine, thank you. Okay, why are you here, right? Those cognitive reserves really kick in. I think that's where it's really important to share, and I say share your observations. We're not just saying the bad things, we're saying the things that she's doing well, the times of day when things are starting to have more challenges. And so for a family member, because their radar is up, they're scared, they're concerned, they may have expectations that the doctor's going to see it too. Well, the doctor gets a snapshot, right? The doctor gets a moment in time. So really helping family members sort of keep notes. Don't necessarily review those notes with your person unless they too have concerns, and by all means, they should be the ones that are informing the physician of the changes. But to do so in a way that is in partnership with the medical community, that's going to help see if it is a dementia-related disease or condition, or is it something else? They're not controlling their blood sugars, or they're not sleeping well, or there's other things that could be contributing to changes in cognition that can be treated.
So if I'm taking those notes, right, what are things that I should be looking for to take notation on without mom feeling like I'm...
So some of the common things are repetition, so changes in short-term memory. She's asking me the same question over and over and over again. One, she might be doing that because it's super important. Two, it could be because it's the first time I'm asking you. So repetition is a hallmark. Not recognizing familiar people is another big area of concern. Getting lost in time and place. So familiar places that someone's driving to church and back home and they get lost. Not because there's a detour, but because it's part of the routine is being interrupted. Starting to have changes in how I put myself together for the day, making mistakes with clothing selection, using things in different ways than they intend to be used. And then a lot of changes in mood. So, that protective brain is gonna make me have heightened emotions. Well, maybe they're justified, or maybe there's something else going on. So time changes, time awareness changes, getting lost, repetition, my ability to do my self-care are often pretty big hallmarks that get people's attention. If I can't recall your name in a moment, that's more typical aging. Names get harder as we age. If it takes me longer to process something and respond to you, that's typical aging. Give me a moment.
So say your loved one gets lost on the way home from church, and now I'm like, oh no, something is not right. Who is the first person I should be calling? Who's that first appointment that I should be making?
I would have a sensitive conversation with the person, right? This is about me you're talking about. I'm the one that got lost, right? So gosh, Mom, that must have been a hard moment. That's really scary. What are your thoughts about when you might want to retire from driving? Because I sure don't want to take the keys away from you. And just start having a partnership. Because if you start hitting me with all the things I'm doing wrong, guess who I'm not going to want to advocate for me as this disease progresses, right? I'm going to not see you as somebody that I can partner with. I'm going to see you as someone I'm going to have to hide all these symptoms from. And that's a dangerous. So I would say start with the person that got lost and have a conversation with sensitivity, not with putting them on defense.
Yeah. And there are so many degrees of one's insight into what is happening to them, and that can fluctuate too. And so always going to them first, and someone may not have a lot of awareness of what happened or how they're feeling, but they may. And you might have a very open and engaged conversation about that event, whatever it was, and be able to think together in all kinds of really helpful ways, even before getting to the doctor.
So, though, with unawareness, and I say and, not but, and
Yeah.
you don't want to be the heavy if you're in that primary care position. So I'm going to put it on Justin's plate to say, I'm going to write a letter to DMV and have them do a medical review, and you're going to need to get evaluated. Because it's sure a lot easier to be mad at him than it is at my daughter. And then it could even get bigger because we don't want to fire our doctor. The insurance company is requiring you to get an evaluation. DMV is the one that decided. DMV is a big entity. We can be mad at DMV together. All day. For the DMV people that are listening to this, thank you for being the heavy in that situation. And it's super important to have a plan. If someone is going to retire from driving, whether it's their choice or not, how are you going to still provide for them to get where they need to go so that they can continue to be part of their rhythm in life?
With my mom, when I've tried to have the gentle conversations, sometimes she's totally open. I just don't know what's going on with my mind. I've lost my mind. It's just terrifying. Other times, there's nothing wrong with me. Of course I'm fine. But my dad was the one who decided that they would stop driving. And, he's, as I said, he's with her 24/7. So we have a thing where if he needs a fall guy, I'm it. And even though I'm there with them, sometimes it's just easier. I'll say, Dad, put Mom on the phone, or, Dad, I'm, talking to Mom about this. And because you do need to, if you're that person getting slammed all the time, it's really hard. And I think that's, one of the important things is to make sure. It's hard to have my mom, when she goes into, well, she took my keys away, we have no freedom, we can't drive anymore, and people will always have a nice response, but it's just, it's a whole different thing. So sometimes I get the mom who is totally aware that something is happening, and sometimes I get the mom who is just, she doesn't want to hear anything about it, and you never know which one you're going to get, which is hard. Yeah.
And that's where you don't want to be in this situation, right?
Exactly.
You can aim it off a wither. Like, I don't know why that doctor made you have to give up driving. Right? Match the emotion. I hear you. This is hard. I hate it for you. I hate it for me. And we're going to get through this together.
Because she might not remember what it was about, but she remembers that there were some awful feelings.
Negative things, yeah.
And so she will not know what she's upset about, but she will certainly know. There's been times where she would not speak to my dad and I for an hour after doctor's appointments. And then, eventually she would come through, but it's.
So validating that this is hard.
Right.
And that you didn't ask for it.
Yeah.
And we're going to get through it together. It goes a long way. I'm glad she has you as a daughter.
Thank you. I'm glad I have her as a mother, truly. But.
Well, thank you. I think this has been I've learned a ton in this conversation, and I think so much that we've heard is that it's about being present and first and foremost being there for your person, building that team around a human being who's going through a hard thing. And glad that we're able to have this time and talk those things through. Does anyone, or I guess would each person like to share their one last thought around kind of those initial stages of this journey?
Yeah, one of my sayings, and I often will use this in a clinical environment where I'm teaching, is there is as many different subtypes of dementia as there are people living with dementia. Right? Everybody is different. Everybody is unique, and walking that journey in the full embrace of that uniqueness is a critical part of this, and advocate for that. That's encourage your doctors and your nurses and everybody else involved to engage that person-centeredness, and then continue to build and cultivate that in your home life too.
I would say, this is really the sayings, connect, don't correct, right? Put the relationship as the primary focus. And I don't know about you, but I don't like to be scolded or have people tell me the things that are going wrong. So connect, don't correct, to have more success in helping navigate this journey.
I think it's a roller coaster. There's some really wonderful highs, and sometimes you're at the bottom and you just don't know what's going on. And you have to remember, I think for me, it took me a little while to remember, this isn't my mom saying these, it is my mother, it's her body, but she's not the one who is saying some of these things at times. And just really live in the moments where it's good and just love. And I think, it's gonna change as the disease changes. Something that worked before may not work now. But always, I know with my mother, just touch. The healing touch has been a big thing. And I think that's important, is just to always, even when it's hard and the days are long, just leading with love is the biggest thing that we can do.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.